Hello, I'm here with Françoise Baylis, Distinguished Research Professor Emerita at Dalhousie University. Françoise, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Great. Well, listen, it's always a pleasure to get to share my ideas with people, so yes.
So Françoise, I'd like to start by hearing from you how you came to be working in the field of bioethics and applied ethics.
I think from a very early age, I was interested in issues of ethics. I was brought up in a family that had that as sort of dinner conversation, you know, what's the right thing to do under certain circumstances. But I think in terms of it becoming an idea that this could be a professional practice, if you will, it really starts in my first year at university. I'm in a class and I'm taking one of everything because I don't know what I want to do, and I take a course in philosophy. And I go to this class and they're talking about this old guy, Socrates. And I'm going like, oh gosh, this is boring. And I'm complaining about this to a friend of mine and they say, oh, you should take the course in French. So I'm at a bilingual university because all of my education up until that point had been in French. And I was worried, would I be able to transition? Could I work in English? Would I be able to write essays in English? So I'd taken this particular course in English and I thought, well, I'll get out of the English philosophy course and I'll register for the French philosophy course because I've been told it's a much better course. And I'm not exaggerating or lying. The first class we're talking about whether or not masturbation is acceptable. And I'm thinking, this is philosophy? I can do this. This is philosophy? And I say that because I was brought up in a Catholic family and this conversation was happening because we were talking about assisted human reproduction. And this is 1979, and Louise Brown, the first IVF baby, has just been born, and the Vatican is not happy. And one of the many things is this controversy around how you get access to sperm. And look at where we are today in terms of that technology. But if I can be succinct, it was philosophy for me meant it's the invitation to think for yourself. And as a young person, that was just wonderful. And so I was off to the races.
Did you find there was resistance to your ideas in terms of addressing these contentious social issues?
I think there's always been resistance to my ideas, but I think my ideas have been developed in resistance to others. Certainly, when people look at sort of my academic trajectory, it seems like I'm bouncing around all over the place, and I actually can see a very clear arc. It starts off, the arc very much starts off with things that make me angry. You know, and it's like, I have to say something because this is absolutely crazy, ridiculous. What could you be thinking? But a lot of it is, over the years, grounded in women's health. And it does obviously move to something specific to women's reproductive health, but really just this deep concern about disenfranchisement in the workplace, disenfranchisement within the family, within social institutions, lack of opportunities. And I can honestly say I was brought up in a way that I had not experienced any kind of discrimination on the basis of sex and gender until I went to university. And again, a formative moment. I'm in now a graduate class and I'm saying something and a male student beside me just says, yes, 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 and then starts talking over me. And I'm stunned. What has just happened? Because I've not been exposed to that before, and this male professor didn't correct them, didn't give me space, didn't, you know. And so I think it was this intersection of an interest in thinking for myself, thinking about women's issues, and then, you know, moving forward with that as sort of a pathway.
It's fascinating. With so many potential battles to choose, how did you identify where to put your energies? What was the first thing that made you angry, that you turned your attention to?
Well, I think it was generic insofar as I was always made to believe, rightly or wrongly, I was made to believe that I have talents and that I need to use them in the service of others because not everyone has the same gifts. And so when you're taught that from a very early age, I think you're really looking to see where is it that people are marginalized or disenfranchised, or ways in which I can use my skills to help others who, you know, have the same kind of claims and rights that I want to make, but maybe don't have the same facility, either in terms of language or courage, etc. I think one of my really early concerns had to do with issues of race and gender. And the reason I say race and gender is because I'm actually mixed race, and many people cannot read that off my body. And so that's put me in a number of very interesting situations where, quite frankly, I was exposed to extremely offensive, racist comments, and I would be surprised, and I would turn and say, well, I find that offensive. And people would be surprised that I would find it offensive because, again, as I said, they couldn't read certain things off my body. And so one of my very early pieces is on, it's titled Black as Me, Narrative Identity, and I talk about what it means to have been brought up as a black person in a context where you're walking around in a white body. And I think one of the things that's very interesting is I actually have what people would consider street cred in that claim, because it's very easy to contest my claim that I'm black. And yet my mother is the first successful case of racial discrimination in employment in Canada. So how could this be my mother and I am not black? And I say that in a context where she was a very strong activist woman, obviously, and again, a person who believed that she had talents that she needed to use in the service of others. Her case lasted a dozen years, and she was successful, and the employer who failed to employ her was fined $25. So you can imagine that you're doing this because of a belief and a cause and a commitment. I don't even know if she was the person who received the $25 or what happened with it. We just know that that was the judgment. It might never even have been paid at that point. But I think it's really looking around to see who's marginalized, who's disenfranchised. And I think for me, even when I'm looking at a high-end technology, a frontier technology, we could be thinking about that in the context of neurotechnologies, we could be thinking about that in the context of genome editing. No matter where I'm looking, it's to see, we all understand what the potential benefits are. If we didn't see the benefits, we wouldn't be running down this pathway. And I see my job as to say, okay, I can see all those benefits too, but where are the harms? What are we not seeing? What are we not anticipating? Who might not actually benefit? And I think I've also done a lot of work around who's in the room. And I wrote a paper with a colleague of mine, Sue Sherwin, who for many years I was in awe of. And we wrote this paper on the feminist ethics consultant as architect and advocate. And the architecture part was really about paying attention to the spaces within which conversations happen, the spaces within which decisions get made, who gets to be there, who understands the rules of the game. And I think in that work, what I've tried to push forward is the difference between people who are comfortable in a lab, people who are comfortable in a business room, people who are comfortable in a kitchen. And so the kitchen becomes a metaphor for the places where we need to have tough conversations. And we do that. There was a time when nobody would have said publicly, I'm infertile, and now it's dinner conversation, or it can be. I think the same is true with something like Prozac. Nobody would say, oh, I've got a problem of mental health and I'm taking Prozac, whereas again, now it can be dinner conversation. So what would it mean to take these contentious issues and make them available to people? In other words, give them some tools within which they can explore ideas that they have, bring their ideas to this technology, and facilitate conversations. And I think that's really what my work's about now. It's about how to share complicated ideas so that everybody can participate in the conversation.
That's fascinating. I think one thing I'm really struck by in your response is how, as a scholar, you're very conscious of how your work affects and is affected by these broader social and political changes, conscious of you coming to university after the ferment of, or in the midst of the ferment of second wave feminism. And now I'm curious to know the conversation around race, gender, intersectionality that's taking place in activist and other circles. How do you think that's affecting the scholarly work of bioethics and applied ethics research?
Well, I think there is a concerted effort to make space in a way that there hasn't been before. And some of that is just making sure that there's increased diversity in the terms of the ideas that are available and accessible to people, but also increased diversity just in terms of visual representation, which we've certainly been aware of, if not functionally attentive to. I think if you are a person who appears to be of one race or one gender, and you walk into a space where everything is other than what you are, it is very discomforting. And there's just no way to understand that if you haven't experienced it. And so I think, one of the things that is very positive is that there's, I think, genuine attention to some of these issues and concerns in terms of making space. I think there's two things that are still a bit of a problem. One of them is we've become enamored with this idea of EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, and it's become rote, and I think it's a failure to understand you're looking to make cultural systemic changes, and that's not about coining phrases and pandering in a particular kind of way. I'm not saying it always is that, but I have seen some of that, and that's actually quite disconcerting. And I think the other thing is a failure to sort of listen deeply to what people are saying. And they're the problem, and this is a challenge I still face, and it's this struggle between knowing how and when do you speak with as opposed to speaking for. And I say that because I think most people who are like-minded would agree that at most you want to speak with. So the ideal is that you've created an opportunity, you have confidence, this person has the ability, the talent, they just need to be able to help over the door sill. And the helping often is just making it a welcoming space, right? So, and then you trust people can do their own thing, and what they need to do, they just have to be invited in. And again, some of that inviting is not one-on-one, you are invited, so it's not an exercise of power, it's making it welcoming such that I want to step over the door sill. But I think beyond that, there are times where I still struggle with, are we at a stage in that discourse, in that conversation, where it would be more helpful to speak for, because people still feel intimidated, unable to express themselves in environments that they don't see as welcoming. And if I have a trust relationship, can I do that? And I say that in a context where sometimes I've been asked to do it, and I've actually felt I had needed to say no. I'm not the right person to do this, and we're going to have to help you be that person, because it can't come from me, for whatever reason. So I think for me that's still a space that's difficult, and I work hard still to navigate it. I think the commitment is, making places accessible and welcoming.
In a lifetime of scholarly activism, if I can describe your career in that way, what are the concrete achievements that you're most proud of?
Oh gosh, I think, the things that you end up being most proud of are tiny, well for me anyhow, tiny little things. They're actually wordsmithing. It's words that I still work on, because I think words are really important. And there are things, that I took flack for that have now become part of the lexicon of, nobody would know. And it seems a bit strange to even refer to those, because nobody makes a change of that kind, right? Like it's a group of people, so you're really just part of making a change. But I have a couple of few little moments. I remember my dissertation at the PhD level was on the ethics of doing research in the ex utero embryo. So again, now we have for the first time the human embryo outside of the human body. What can we do with this? And there were obviously a number of people with very strong objections to the manipulation of the human embryo, because invariably you're looking at its destruction. And if you believe that that's protectable human life, then you've got a huge moral problem. So I had done work, and it was the culmination of my PhD, arguing that we can find a moral distinction between a viable and a non-viable embryo, and at the very least, it ought to be permissible to do work with the non-viable embryo. So we're just taking a little step. We're saying we can distinguish between embryos that might become like you and me, and we can identify embryos that have no potential to become one of us, and surely they can't make a claim for moral status, so they would be available for research purposes. And I was dismissed as an idiot on the grounds that these embryos are useless because they're in fact in some way, shape, or form defective. Well, we all accept now the difference between a viable and a non-viable embryo, and the non-viable embryo is very much used in the context of research. So again, not claiming that I'm responsible for that, but it's a context and a concept I was working with that, I got insulted for on a couple of occasions. And when you're young, and this was young, I just finished my PhD, you're kind of a little bit bruised. Another thing is we now talk about healthcare ethics as though that's just the term. And when I published a book on healthcare ethics, I had to fight with the publisher to hold on to that title. It was like, no, it should be called medical ethics. It should be called bioethics. It should be called clinical ethics. And insisted, no, it's healthcare. It's broader. For you to say medical puts it in a particular narrow construct. And again, you don't make those kinds of changes as a single person. Other people are doing their advocacy work as well. But it's nice to see that, there's a trajectory where, something's stuck. Other things haven't stuck. I, like other people, have argued against the language of surrogacy and the surrogate mother. And we've said things, like at most you're looking at contract pregnancy. How are you using the term mother? My view is you're only a mother if you have a child. Otherwise, you're a pregnant woman. Now, so you might be a pregnant woman with a child at home. You are a mother, but you're mothering the child at home. You're not a mother to a fetus. Well, some of these ideas haven't had uptake. Maybe it's just temporary. Maybe one day people will see the light from my perspective. But I think those are the things that, I think are interesting. I mean, other than that, everything else seems ephemeral. It's for today, and who knows what will happen tomorrow. Governments change, people change, and it's in flux.
Over the course of your career, you have had a strong interest in frontier technologies. Your latest book, Altered Inheritance, was about CRISPR and genome editing. Now, of course, there's a lot of conversation in bioethics about the impact of AI on healthcare. In your book, you mention that one of your key preoccupations is thinking about the kind of world that we want to live in. I wonder if you could unpack that statement for us in the context of bioethics.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I actually think of that book as my swan song. And other people have asked, what's the next book going to be about? And I've said, and I actually mean it, I said, I actually don't have anything more to say. I feel like I've said it all. And I've said it all because of that question, because what I've tried to say is the technology you're interested in doesn't actually matter. If I rewrote that book about AI, it would be the exact same book. It's just instead of talking about genome editing, I talk about AI, because I'm trying to make the same point. And the point I'm trying to make is we get distracted by frontier technology, and we think this is really cool science, and what can we do with this really cool science? And I'm saying, you know what? You've got the wrong question. The right question, from my point of view, has you pull back from that technology and say, what kind of world do I want to live in, and how might this technology help me build that world? And so I'm very worried when we don't pay attention to that question first. And I think that that's a problem from my perspective with a lot of contemporary bioethics. And what I mean by that is many people now are working in the space of how can we do X ethically? So how can we do human genome editing ethically? How can we do AI ethically? And I want to say, but you have to have answered the prior question. The prior question is it ethical to do human genome editing? Then you figure out how to do it ethically. Is it ethical to pursue artificial intelligence? Then you figure out how to do that ethically. And that first question has to be informed by some kind of vision of a future world that you want to create and leave behind. Because the kinds of changes I'm thinking about, because they're social, cultural, systemic, they might not happen in your lifetime. So your commitment in terms of the activism has to be to do whatever you can to pull in that direction or to steer the boat in that direction. But you also have to be bringing other people along with you. Because if you don't, you're never going to get sustainable change. And so it requires a commitment to a particular vision, and then it requires a commitment to sharing that with others and inviting others to come along for the ride. And so in the book, I start by asking that question, what kind of world do you want to live in? And I try to answer that throughout the book, and I try to end with, if you want to live in that world too, well then these are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about. So I think of the work as an invitation to say, can we dream up a world that's wonderful for all of us? And that world for me very much includes flourishing for all. So the work is grounded in consensus building, the work is grounded in solidarity, and I would say specifically an understanding of solidarity that cannot be collapsed into us and them. Because when I did a lot of research around this concept, it was surprising and disappointing how much of it was us being solidaire, solid with those who are like us, against some kind of common enemy, even if the common enemy is a caricature. And I want to say, well, we actually need to find a different way to live in the world. And I think with respect to our recent challenge, COVID, I think it's an epic fail. And I wrote that book just before the pandemic started, and I never would have predicted that we would do so badly when faced with a common challenge, because that's where you really had something where, from my perspective, if you were a selfish individual, you should have done something different than we did. If you were an individual with, that was community minded, we should have done something different than we did. So how is it that regardless of what your intuitions or orientation might have been, that we did so poorly as sort of a communal response to a communal problem?
It seems to me that one of the challenges you've identified is that in pursuing that vision of a future world, that requires some kind of conversation between scholars, scientists and the general public. And in these times of increasing political but also epistemic polarisation in terms of the realities that different groups live in, that becomes increasingly difficult. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about how can scholars, activists, politicians promote that kind of consensus building to create a common framework for the future world that we want to build?
So I think that I've been very much influenced by work done by women activists in the 1980s who were activists for peace, ultimately. And I think, we're still there. We're still having to be activists for peace. And that's peace in a context not just of war, but climate change, et cetera. How can we create an environment in which there's room for all of us? I think we need to become much better listeners. I think we need to take responsibility for our contributions to conversations, but also responsibility for when we're quiet, right? And you fail to speak up. And I think, given my upbringing and some of what I've already shared with you, I think I'd like to try to believe that I'm attentive to personal limitations, and so you don't have expectations that people can't meet. I have two mantras that really informed my academic work, and I think still inform my public work. And that's to make the powerful care, and we are all frail and fallible. And for me, to make the powerful care was very much a part of my training and teaching of the next generation. And part of that was to say, very often we don't actually know who the powerful people are. You might think it's an elected official, but actually it's somebody else behind the scenes doing something different. And so part of the work for those of us who are working to try to build a better, more ethical, more moral world is to find out who has power so that they can actually exercise it in the direction that you think makes sense. And then, the part that we're all frail and fallible is to understand that, people can be well-intentioned and make mistakes. And there aren't that many people that are truly evil. Unfortunately, I believe that there are some who are truly evil. And I don't know how you deal with that. I really don't.
Perhaps disproportionately represented in positions of power and influence today. In these times, it's easy to feel a sense of hopelessness and despair, but I wonder whether there are particular sources of hope or optimism, projects that are happening right now that you've seeded or been involved with, or that you can see your influence upon, that give you a sense of hope and optimism about the future.
I think even those of us who might think we're pessimists actually are hopeful because we get up every morning and we do something every day, right? And I think that means that you believe that you're having an impact on the world, no matter how minuscule it is. And I say that in the context that sometimes all you need to do is to say hello to a stranger and you've made their day, and you'll never know it, right? You'll never know it. So, what does it mean to just get up and be a part of the community that you live in, and to contribute and to be friendly and to have a smile on your face as you walk down the road? But then also maybe to be sympathetic if somebody's walking down the road and they don't look so cheerful, maybe they're having a bad day. It doesn't take much to say, oh, I like your glasses as you're passing by, for example. So, am I hopeful? I'm hopeful because we have people that follow in our footsteps. All of us have people that follow in our footsteps. And I think, they get up in the morning and they do things, and we need to support them in what they're doing. And I can honestly say, as somebody who's, at a sort of a different stage in my career, I look at a lot of my work as breadcrumbs. I don't have high expectations, right? It's breadcrumbs, and my hope is that somebody else will pick that up and do work with it. And so it's a success if I've left a breadcrumb. I mean, isn't that a wonderful thing, that's all you need to do is leave something behind for somebody to pick up and work with?
Françoise, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.